Hi, and welcome, and thank you very much for having me. My name is Gillie, and today I'm going to share with you some of the findings from a 4-year research study that I undertook as part of my doctorate in education that I just completed at the Open University this year. So I'm just going to share with you my motivation, outline the research, and share a few findings with you. I was incredibly fortunate that about 100 families were super generous with their time and sharing their stories with me. And I hope that you'll appreciate their honesty as I have, and that these will both inform and empower you. So the motivation for me was that I had been a primary school teacher and gradually moved into learning support, and over time become more and more specialised in that way. And having completed a master's in special educational needs, I was working freelance and doing quite a lot of volunteering, and I kept meeting children and parents who were finding that school just didn't work for them. Number of children who had been expelled, encouraged to leave, just been completely overwhelmed and just couldn't carry on at school. And it seemed to me that this was, first of all, wrong. I couldn't understand why schools weren't doing what they should do to help these children and their families. But it also shocked me that there were so many children, so many families that I was meeting. And as I started to do my research, I think the news started to break in the press as well. And I realized that this was much more prevalent than I could have possibly imagined. And that's really been the focus of the last 4 years of my life. So share some of those findings with you today. So at the outset, I had thought that I would conduct a survey. This was something I had some experience of, having done surveys in previous research and from my master's. And I was encouraged by my wonderful supervisors to really get to know my participants, and that I should perhaps focus on fewer families and maybe find 4 to 6 families who I could get in-depth case studies talk with those people. And I understood what they were saying, and I realized that they were right, but I was very reluctant to give up this idea that I'd originally had of a survey. So in the end, I did both. And I wanted to ask, I suppose I knew the answers that I was looking for, the questions that I would need to ask, but I wanted the questions to be really, really relevant to my participants. So at the very beginning, I met with several parents who were also home educators and whose children all had sometimes diagnosed, not always diagnosed, but learning differences that hadn't been supported in school. And I asked them, what questions would you like to be asked? What do you think is important? What do parents want to share? And between us, we came up with the questionnaire that informed the survey, and that also became the basis for my interviews. So at the very, very beginning, I was very reliant on home educators to support me through this research. They were entirely, you have been entirely my community over these past years. So as a starting point, I interviewed parents because I wanted to really get a sense of how they felt and how, whether they felt that my approach would be suitable with children as well before I approached children directly. And then I was lucky to recruit 4 families where I interviewed the parents and the children. And I had 7 children in total who talked to me, 6 directly and 1 through the survey. And I, at the same time, had my internet survey going on, and 93 of those responses came from the UK, so they were included in my research. There were a few from the US, which was interesting, but my focus was what was happening in Britain, so I haven't included their data. So at the end of all of this, I had rather a lot of data to go through, and I can't tell you how much it affected me. It took a very, very long time to do the analysis, not just because obviously I needed to do this carefully and do it justice and be entirely ethical, but because some of the stories were incredibly impactful, and I had to take my time with them for my own health, to be perfectly honest with you. So just to give you a sense of how I worked with children, generally, we had a very unstructured interview where I asked them mainly, tell me what school was like for you, and tell me what home education is like for you. And children just talked really openly, very generously, very insightfully and reflectively, to be perfectly honest with you. And some of the children were as young as 6. And what I did was, as they were talking, they were either creating a drawing or I was making notes, and we came up with a method of recording what they'd said in different ways, so that it would be something that they could then check back themselves and annotate and change, and really make sure that I captured what they wanted to say. And this was done in different ways for different children, but the basic premise was through using a concept map, so that all of the ideas related to school and all of the ideas related to home and the ones that crossed over were all arranged and accessible. And some children did this entirely on their own. I had children who used the software that I've used here. For some children, I scribed. For one participant who participated online, I created this after we'd had our interview and emailed it for her to check with her mum. So this was a way for me to really make sure that I'd truly represented what they wanted to say. And with parent interviews, I created a transcript and I shared that transcript with parents before turning it into a case study. And then I shared the case study with parents again, so that everything was written out chronologically, and they could see again, you know, is this how I feel? Is this how I'm happy to be represented? So there were several stages to getting to the final data that I put into my study. And because I'd started from a point of looking at children whose needs hadn't been met at school, for me, it was important to understand, well, what were these needs? How did the families see these needs? And as you can see, anxiety was very, very high on the list. That's possibly not surprising, given what I imagine some of you have experienced and what we see in the news. But there was quite a big spread, and quite a few of the children, as you can see. So everything that's highlighted in orange here are instances where parents talked of more than one diagnosis or more than one difficulty. And this is the norm. We know that, you know, we all have complex profiles, and that we may have some aspects of dyslexia or some difficulties that are related to autism, and nothing is really completely straightforward. But as you can see, lots of different reasons why, lots of different diagnoses that were attached to these children who were finding school so very, very difficult. And one of the first questions I asked parents was, you know, what did you think? What were your plans when you first sent your children to school? And overwhelmingly, parents just expected them to go to school, maybe go and do A-levels, possibly go to university, that they'd be included and supported if their needs were identified. You know, some parents sent their children initially to school already with a diagnosis and had talked to the school and expected support to be in place, but had assumed that if there were any complications, that children would be supported. And the biggest answer was that schools would allow children to thrive, to love learning, to be excited. So I've just got a few of the quotes that parents shared with me here. I'll give you a little bit of time to take them in. So in academic research, we're often encouraged to try to find a model, a way of explaining and understanding what's happening, what's causing something, what pattern things are following. And it seemed quite clear to me in the very beginning that what parents were saying was missing was what they simply expected of the school system. So if we look at various pieces of legislation, frameworks, things that may be statutory, may just be guidance, but everything that comes through from government and that's available to parents because we've all got access to the internet these days, everything tells us that schools should be inclusive places, that they should be safe, that they should be stimulating, that there should be respect, that there's a collaboration that should be happening between schools and families. And this is not anything new. This is something that we've been talking about for decades. And it struck me that this model that Bronfenbrenner came up with originally, gosh, going back into the mid 20th century, but gradually developing it over time, that this was a way of recognizing what we expect of schools. So at the very center, we've got the child and their individual profile, their needs. And this idea that, you know, within school, at home, we should have support. So we call it a microsystem. So the immediate surroundings that the child is in. And this should be a cocoon. It should be welcoming and gentle and enveloping and supporting environment. But what was happening for these children was that these were the negative experiences, that it was a harsh environment and that children couldn't thrive. And again, you know, we expect that a school will provide connections. So if you need a referral, that they will make that referral for you. If you need support with your GP, that they will be there to support you. And what parents were reporting over and over and over again was that schools were either being quite unhelpful or blocking or just downright negative in their communications and their behavior, the way that they may or may not have bridged between the child through the school to the local authority or to the health authority. This was just a really dysfunctional relationship. And because of that, everything else just wasn't working. And over time, the situation was only getting worse. So for me, this sort of idea of all of these interlinked systems supporting the child, they were collapsing at the very, very first point because the school environment just wasn't a supportive one. And again, I'm sorry to perhaps bore you with theory, but I think it's a really useful way of understanding things on a bigger scheme, and especially when we're trying to communicate these difficulties to people who haven't been listening, to say, look, you know, there's some precedence for this. We can look into human history and understand why these patterns are important. And Van Gennep, and this is going back way beyond 1960, this is just the translation, but he came up with this idea of threshold concepts, the idea of being on the edge, being in a situation where you're, you know, coming through a process. And when we first take our children to school, we're on the edge. We're on this precipice between being a parent and being the parent of a school-age child. And for a child, they're on this edge of being at home and becoming a pupil, a student, whatever you might want to call children who go to school. But it's a rite of passage. And in a normal situation, you know, it might take some time. It might take a day. It might take some hours for some children. It might take weeks. It might take an academic year. But over time, this should just become a transition that's gone through and is natural, as much as you can call any human construct natural, but that is something that's doable for everybody. But clearly this wasn't happening for these children. Because this idea around transition, it is, you know, humans, we are ritualistic beings, But this is an accepted part of transition. It's systematic. Children go to school at a certain age. It's institutionalized, this idea in our society that children go to school, and it tends to be planned. And it's quite normal that this idea of liminality, this point of transition, this period that may extend, could be a passageway rather than a doorway, if you like. But it's normal in the modern world. And we talk about it in terms of children going to school. We talk about it in terms of this sort of, we even talk about rites of passage when we talk about children going through puberty, going into high school. So lots of pre-existing literature around this in terms of children making these changes in their lives and families making these changes as children go to school. So it seemed to me like a useful tool for me to use as well. So going back to what did parents experience? So they had these very high hopes of school, but what they talked about feeling as they got their children to school, but things didn't work. And they felt ignored. They felt left out of their children's education. And going back to those statutory documents, they all say that there's got to be collaboration, there's got to be communication. So what's going wrong? And this feelings of being ignored sometimes escalated into real conflict in relationships with schools, often because parents were saying, but have a look. I can see he's not happy, she's not happy. There's something, I need your help. And teachers either saying, leave it to us, where the professionals, go away, or denying needs. And for some parents, this was almost years where they felt they were on the edge and pushed out and feeling not welcome and not supported. And the children at the same time getting to feel worse and worse and worse about the situation. And of course, if you're expecting a system to be supportive and it isn't, that's almost, it's insult to injury, isn't it? And to me, it seemed perhaps that some of these expectations were based on this promise of policy, because we've been told that it's going to be supportive. We've been told it will be like this. You will be helped. It will be good for everybody. So parents gave me a lot of information about this. And 3/4 of parents felt that their children's needs were entirely denied, misunderstood. Of those, over half felt that their concerns had just been completely ignored. Parents had repeated meetings. Those meetings failed, obviously exacerbating the situation all the time, building up conflict. Ideas around children falling behind. I mean, how do we measure something like that? But whether the school told them that their child was behind, or whether they felt that their child was behind, or whether the child felt that they weren't keeping up. This was a really important thing that the families talked about. And a lot of parents talked, not so many as this denial, but about how this led to a loss of trust. So a loss of trust in the professionals, in the school, in the system. So when parents said that their children's needs were just not understood, just looking, I started to sort of look, see, well, what else did people say? And for most people, they had at least 2 of these negative experiences. And many of them had 3 or more. And as this sort of transitional period extended, families seemed to become disconnected from their normal educational relationships. So I'd ask them, what did you think before children went to school? And again, this idea that school would support my child, although we had this diagnosis. Well, there shouldn't be an although in there, should there? I have a diagnosis. Here are my child's needs. How are you going to support? But this same parent who'd gone into school full of hope and full of honesty said, 3 years of unmet needs. I think using a word horrendous when you're describing what your child's experience is like, you know, between the ages of 5 and 7 is really pretty shocking. And they applied for an EHCP and were told, yes, you stay where you are. And at this point, that just, for this parent, it was the final straw. And lots of parents telling me very similar stories. And this idea of transition, I keep coming back to this, and I'm sorry if it's not what you were expecting today, but I think it's, as I say, it's helpful for people outside of these situations to try to understand them. That parents are in between the stable position of being a parent of a school-age child and being in an unknown position of being an unplanned and unwanted home educator, and feeling, as Turner said, betwixt and between. So I'm not the parent I thought I was going to be. I don't feel confident in the role that I find myself in. And this stretching out of this experience that, you know, you don't feel safe in your own environment and you trying to support your own child, and yet things are not right for you. This came through very, very, very prominently in my research. When parents talked about, you know, fighting for their children's rights. And one parent who talked about, you know, talked very openly with the head teacher. Head teacher admitted it had taken her 6 years to get a statement for her child, with all of the power that she had, or the knowledge that she had as a head teacher. And not surprisingly, she thought, well, gosh, if I feel like this after 3 months, if we feel like this as a family after 3 months, how can we survive a 6-year fight? And again, for her, that was the point where she decided, I can do this better myself. This is better for all of us, and especially for my child if we're at home. And over and over again, people saying to me, it wasn't my idea. I didn't start out to do this. I didn't come to this on my own. The system brought me here. And again, bringing that back to theory, this idea of being in a situation that's outside of your control. You don't know what's going to happen to you. And it's not until perhaps you become a confident home educator in a home education community that loss of control, that loss of understanding and knowing your own situation can start to normalize. And I can tell you, Minnie's one of the strongest ladies I know. And if she felt like that, then I can only begin to imagine how some parents must feel. These feelings of liminality, of being outside of the norm, they were very, very strongly represented throughout the data, both from parents who I interviewed and parents who participated in the survey. And so being outside of the societal norm is difficult. Difficulties with school relationships, you know, a supportive relationship that becomes an oppressive relationship. But also for some parents, actually not knowing how to go about making connections with home educators. And Ramona was someone who actually had a really good friend who was a home educator. But although she had this good friend who was a home educator, she didn't realize that home education could be something for her, because she felt that this was something that was private and people didn't share outside of the home education community, and that she couldn't just join this community. And it took time. She did realize that she could. But as she was going through some really difficult times, 6 years of difficulty in communications with school as her daughter became less and less confident. And it took some fairly horrendous experiences again for her to come to the realization that home education was going to be best for both of them. I'm bringing this back to theory again, but Turner talks about liminality starting as a breach. We expect something. Our child goes to school and they will go off and be happy and develop a level of learning. That doesn't happen. We have a breach. Think of it as a wedge being driven into the relationship. And then we can have a period of crisis where we think, well, it's going to get better. I'm going to a meeting, it's going to be better. I'll go to parents' evening, it'll be better. I'm going to apply for an EHCP or get that needs assessment booked. It's going to be better. And all of these situations were negative experiences, and the crisis just keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. Now, in Turner's theory, there should be redressive action. Now, this would come from the school, theoretically, to limit the spread of the crisis, to stop it becoming something that's out of control. What we're finding, or what I found in my research, was that consistently this wasn't happening. Where schools had the opportunity to come in and support families, they just didn't take the opportunity. They didn't make the steps that were necessary for families to be able to come back into school with any form of trust. And that left the situation where reintegration, which is Turner's final stage, became impossible. How could children reintegrate into school without this trust, without this support? So something's going wrong, and these stages can't play out the way that they should. So I've kind of talked through this already on the previous slide, but the sorts of things that were causing difficulties, this discord, this wedge being driven, transition difficulty. So that could have been starting school at all. It could have been going from infants to juniors, from primary school to secondary school. Children weren't being supported, their needs weren't being met. They might have been bullied, sometimes even by teachers. And children becoming unwilling or even unable to go to school. And all the time, this idea that things could be fixed, that there could be redressive action, that children could be reintegrated, but parents' expectations weren't being met. And they searched and searched for solutions, and they had meeting after meeting after meeting, but it all just kept making the situation worse until eventually they broke away completely. And home education was what many of them felt was the only thing left open to them. Now, I have to tell you that for most parents, they then said, but it was the best thing I ever did. And it's clear that for those families, that could well have been the best thing they ever did, but it wasn't their choice. And for some parents, this feeling of liminality, even after the decision to home educate has been made, continues. Lucy told me how people would stop her on the bus and ask her why her child wasn't at school. Family members, parents, the child's grandparents being really unsupportive. Friends saying, oh, you've ruined your child's educational chances now. These kinds of experiences all pushing parents or families into situations where they don't feel they can trust anyone anymore. Maybe even stopping them from feeling that they can join into local home education communities because they feel so very, very isolated. But, and I'm taking you back to theory again here, Turner's idea was that communitas, a community of people who've been through the process before, can support. Now, in a ritual situation, if we go into, ancient tribal situations, this ritual would happen where a young person, whatever, it could be at any stage, sometimes it's childbirth, it could be anything, becoming a widow, any sort of situation that happens in life becomes ritualized, that someone else who's been through that process goes through it with you, supports you through it, and brings you back into the community afterwards. Now, for these families, that's no longer possible. So what they're having, what's happening for them is that this community is actually helping them establish a new normal in their new situation as home educators. And these different groups of people were where people found support and legitimization. They've been pushed out of society and then brought back in to a new societal norm. And some of that was through social networks, huge numbers of people talking about support via Facebook groups. Some people had great support from their families and friends. Some people had support from special educational needs groups. And of course, eventually, for most people, they were getting support from local home educators and national home educator groups online, but local ones locally. And this was the first step for them in some kind of normality being reestablished. So again, just showing you in terms of the proportions of these groups. And you can see the sort of national groups, they play a part, but hugely important, these local home education groups and the support of people in social media. And there's, again, dragging you back to theory, but in Turner's theory, the idea is that you can put on a mask, you become anonymous in a sense, and on social media, you can be anonymous, you can ask for help without judgment because no one knows you, no one knows who you are, and you can be supported. And that can be an important step in moving forward to develop your confidence. You shouldn't need to put on a mask, but some people, understandably feel like that after everything they've been through. So coming back to that reintegration, and it's pretty clear from my data and from everything people have told me that reintegration into school is not something people are going to go for after everything they've been through. In fact, the very specific question was asked, and the vast majority of people said, no way. There were some people who said, yes, we'll be open to it, maybe at transition to secondary school or for A-levels or for college. But the vast majority of people were saying, I can't see this happening for my child. And Turner's idea was that reintegration could only happen if this process of being reintegrated into what's considered normal society had happened many, many, many times successfully. So this idea that if schools understand why children may leave and know how to bring them back in, then it can work. So that point where we have the redressive action, where schools actually realize that something's not right and do the right thing and do the supportive thing, that point is when schools can provide the communitas. But right now, we're seeing it's not happening. So again, I looked at all of my data and came up with what I thought might be useful suggestions, recommendations for future practice. And I went back out to the people who participated in my research. So to the people who had helped me to conceive of the questions initially, and to the people who'd participated in interviews and said, this is what's coming out. Do you agree with these suggestions? And they all said, well, yeah, these seem like sensible things, and it's not surprising that that's what you're seeing from what people have told you. So clearly, and perhaps you've come to this conclusion from listening to me, if schools and education departments were to actually consult with or employ parents who've experienced home education, parents who've gone through the process of their child deregistering for reasons beyond the family's control. Also, home educators who are simply experienced home educators by choice, if education departments consulted with and employed these people, brought them into schools to talk to teachers, then teachers would perhaps find that home education is not such a mystery, and they could recognize that it is a valid, entirely legal, and sometimes very desirable form of education. All children are getting most of their education outside of school. So why on earth should home education play any kind of second role when it's the right thing for the family? So to do this, how are we going to go about it? Well, if we're going to include children, there needs to be more training. We know there's not enough training in special educational needs. We also know there is no knowledge, or very little knowledge, about home education within the school, the formal school education networks. We've maybe got an opportunity right now, because lots of teachers have experienced children being educated at home during COVID. So perhaps post-COVID, we've got an opportunity to do something that will make some families' lives much, much easier going forward. And if families choose to stay at home, to educate at home, then clearly there are opportunities to provide resources, to resource share. Perhaps offer flexi-schooling opportunities, provide exam centre resources, do the assessments for reasonable adjustments, enable people to get support with GCSEs. So lots and lots of possibilities, and not vastly expensive ones. And that is really where I'm at the moment. So thank you very, very much for listening. What I'm hoping for moving forward is to get more perspectives, wider perspectives, see what's happening with families and professionals as well, through and beyond COVID-19. So really trying to get the other side of the story, because I've not been very complimentary about schools in my writing, and I have been at times ashamed to be a teacher. But I think post-COVID, there's a chance to get a little bit of that other perspective, and that's my plan for the next few years. Thank you very much for listening. Do feel free to get in touch if you'd like any more information about the previous study or future studies. I'd love to hear from you. Yeah, and I hope you've had a fantastic conference. I'm just sorry I can't be there live today. Just share my references with you. And yeah, say thank you very, very much.